Hey everybody, tonight we are traveling way back. Back before your fancy craft iPass, before German purity laws, even before the Romans were complaining about the Gauls drinking the stuff. We are heading to the sun-baked plains of ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, to uncover the story of how some of the world's first city dwellers, the Sumerians, figured out how to turn humble grain into humanity's favorite social lubricant, beer. Picture it, you're standing Mesopotamia between two mighty rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, under a sky that feels impossibly vast and blue. The air is thick with heat, dust, and the faint, earthy smell of silt carried on the breeze. Around you, fields of barley and wheat shimmer in the haze, the very foundation of life here. Forget your cushy mattress and climate control. Life here is lived close to the earth, dictated by the rhythm of floods and harvests. Frankly, given the lack of antibiotics, decent plumbing, and readily available snacks, you probably wouldn't survive this for more than a few days before succumbing to something unpleasant, or just terminal boredom from the lack of Wi-Fi. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really helps the channel find more folks like you who appreciate drifting off to the past. And hey, drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. There. Dictionary. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, my baby, turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Alright, settle in. Let your eyes adjust to the imagined twilight settling over the plain. Before we can even whisper the word beer, you need to understand the world it was born into. This region, often called the Fertile Crescent for its life-giving waters and productive soil, wasn't always a land of settled farms and bustling towns. For millennia, your ancestors and everyone else's were wanderers, chasing herds and gathering whatever edible plants they could find. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. You notice it in the rhythm of the seasons, the way certain grasses grow reliably near the rivers after the floods recede. People start experimenting, tentatively at first. They learn that if you scatter the seeds from the plumpest stalks of wild barley or emmer wheat, you might get a decent patch growing next season. This isn't farming as you know it, no neat rows, no tractors, just hopeful encouragement of nature's bounty. This slow dance toward cultivation, the Neolithic Revolution, is one of humanity's biggest turning points. It's the moment we started trading the freedom of the hunt for the security of a harvest. Here's a mainstream fact for you. The development of irrigation techniques was absolutely crucial in Mesopotamia, allowing agriculture to flourish, even away from the immediate riverbanks. Imagine yourself part of one of these early settling groups. Your days revolve around the grain. You help clear patches of land using simple stone or bone tools. You learn to watch the sky, praying for timely rain but dreading destructive floods. Harvest time is frantic. Everyone pitches in, cutting the stalks with small, curved sickles, perhaps made with flint blades, set into wood or bone handles. The sun beats down, the sharp edges of the stalks scratch your arms, and the air fills with itchy chaff. It's exhausting work. You bundle the sheaves and carry them back to your settlement, might be a small collection of mud brick huts clustered together for safety and cooperation. Then comes the processing, threshing, beating the stalks to loosen the grains, winnowing, tossing the mixture into the air so the wind carries away the lighter chaff, leaving the heavier kernels to fall. It's dusty, tedious work. Your muscles ache, and after all that effort, what do you have? Hard little kernels of potential, not exactly a gourmet meal. So you grind. You kneel beside a flat or slightly hollowed stone, a saddle quern, and use a smaller handstone to rub back and forth, crushing the kernels into coarse flour roasts. The grating sound fills the air, a constant backdrop to village life. Your shoulders burn, your knees ache from kneeling, but the smell of the crushed grain is promising. Mix it with water, and you get a basic paste. Cook this on a hot stone or in the embers of a fire, and voila, unleavened bread, dense, perhaps a bit gritty but filling. Or you boil the groats with water into a porridge, simple, sustaining, but let's be honest, probably incredibly bland. This is your diet, day in, day out. Grain, maybe some hunted game, if you're lucky, fish from the river, perhaps some gathered greens or pulses. It's fuel, not fun. You can almost taste the monotony, can't you? Like eating plain oatmeal 3 meals a day. Every day, you'd be desperate for a little variety too. Storing this precious grain is a constant battle. Your rudimentary granaries, perhaps clay-lined pits or simple mud brick structures, are vulnerable. Dampness is a huge enemy, leading to mold that can ruin the entire harvest and even be toxic. Then there are the pests. Forget your modern pantry moths. Think bigger, hungrier critters. Mice and rats are obvious threats, but historians pinpoint specific insects like grain weevils. The Cytophilus species were likely culprits even back then. That's a quirky little tidbit. As a major headache, capable of devastating stored supplies, losing your grain meant starvation. Protecting it was paramount. It's within this context, the hard-won grain, the monotonous diet, the challenges of storage, that the magic starts to happen. But it wasn't a deliberate invention, not at first. Historians still argue whether the earliest deliberate cultivation of grain was driven primarily by the desire for bread or for the intoxicating potential of primitive beer. Was it food first or a pleasant buzz? It's a fascinating chicken or egg debate about our ancestors' priorities. Imagine a forgotten bowl of porridge left out too long. Perhaps rainwater got into a container of stored grain. Wild yeasts, naturally present everywhere in the environment, would find this starchy soup irresistible. Fermentation begins. Bubbles appear. The mixture develops a slightly tangy, alcoholic scent. Someone might be driven by hunger, or just curiosity, or perhaps desperation for something less boring than water, takes a sip and discovers it's not half bad. In fact, it's kind of interesting, different, might be even a little bit uplifting after a long day of grinding grain under that relentless Mesopotamian sun. The first step toward beer wasn't a stroke of genius. It was likely a happy accident, born from the very essence of their grain-centered world. Just don't try recreating this at home by leaving your breakfast out. Modern food safety standards exist for very good reasons. Think of it as humanity's first, albeit accidental, foray into the mood-altering properties hidden within those humble, essential kernels. The foundation was laid, not with blueprints and recipes, but with leftover gruel and a touch of microbial magic. So you, or maybe your inquisitive neighbor, Agi, took a tentative sip of that forgotten bubbly grain mush. It didn't kill you. That's a promising start in these times. But what happens next? That first accidental brew isn't likely to trigger an immediate industrial revolution of microbreweries. It's probably subtle. Might be the slightly tangy, slightly fizzy liquid offers a brief moment of difference in a world defined by, let's face it, the crushing predictability of that porridge we talked about. Remember that stuff? Yeah, this is definitely not that. Imagine the scene. A collection of early mud brick dwellings huddled near the life-giving river. The air smells of damp earth, cooking fires, and maybe the river itself. You're watching someone, maybe it's you again, feeling adventurous, looking suspiciously at a clay pot containing leftover grain gruel that started to change. It's frothing slightly. Little bubbles rise to the surface. It smells different. Not spoil, exactly, but active, pungent, maybe a bit like overripe fruit mixed with damp earth. Curiosity battles caution. You poke it with a stick. You sniff it again. Maybe you recall Ugg mentioning something similar last week after that unexpected rain shower soaked a basket of barley. This isn't about following a recipe. It's about pattern recognition, the same skill that helps you track animals or predict the river's moods. You start to notice connections. Grain plus water, left for a while sometimes, does this fizzy thing, especially if it's a bit warm, especially if it's in an open container. What's making it happen? You have no concept of microorganisms. Of course, no idea about the microscopic world teeming around you. For all you know, it's a spirit in the grain, or a trick of the air, or maybe the pot itself has some sort of personality. It's magic as magic as magic. Far as you're concerned, the key ingredient you're unknowingly harnessing is wild yeast. Mainstream fact, these yeasts, particularly various strains of Saccharomyces and other families, are naturally present on the surface of cereal grains, floating in the air, basically everywhere. They are hungry little critters, constantly searching for sugary, starchy environments to feast on. Your grain mush is a 5-star buffet, as they consume the sugars derived from the starches in the barley or emmer. They produce alcohol and a barley or emmer, carbon dioxide, hence the bubbles and the slight buzz. But wild yeasts are, well, wild. They are unpredictable. One batch might ferment quickly, producing a noticeable effect. Another might be sluggish, resulting in something barely alcoholic. Yet another might be contaminated with less friendly bacteria, leading to off flavors that make the mixture genuinely unpleasant or even unsafe. Think of it like relying on stray cats to keep mice away. Sometimes it works brilliantly. Sometimes they just nap in the sun, and occasionally they bring you something you really didn't want. Quality control is non-existent, and the grains themselves aren't the uniform, high-yield varieties you'd find today. You're working with the ancestors of modern barley and wheat. These plants are closer to their wild origins. Their kernels might be smaller, encased in tougher husks that require more effort to remove. Their starch and sugar profiles might be different. Affecting sugar profiles might be different. Fermentation. Some researchers even speculate. Here's a quirky tidbit for the curious, that certain wild or semi-domesticated grains might have occasionally harbored naturally occurring fungi like ergot, which could have added other psychoactive dimensions to these early fermented concoctions, though likely mild and unpredictable. This isn't proven, but it hints at the complex biological soup these early people were dipping their toes into, entirely by chance. So you try it again. Maybe you deliberately leave some porridge out, hoping to replicate the effect. You offer a sip to your family, your neighbors. What do they think? Some might recoil from the sour taste. Others might appreciate the change, the subtle warmth that spreads through the body. Anthropologists debate whether the primary appeal of these proto-beers was the mild mood-altering effect, a welcome escape from the drudgery of daily life, or if it was perceived health benefits. Fermentation can make nutrients in grain more digestible and even produce B vitamins. Perhaps people noticed they felt a bit better, a bit stronger, after consuming theva, fermented liquid compared to just plain water, which could often be contaminated. Was it the slight buzz, or the boost in nutrition, or simply the fact that it tasted kind different that encouraged further experimentation? Imagine the conversations, the shared sips around a flickering fire after a long day's work. Did you try Nara's bubbly grain water? Strange stuff. Mine just tasted like sour mud, but yesterday's batch, that one felt good. There's no instruction manual, just trial and error, passed through observation and word of mouth. You learn that certain conditions seem to work better. My BB leaving the pot near the warmth of the hearth encourages the spirit in the grain. Perhaps using grain that's been slightly sprouted works better, a process called malting, which converts starches to sugars. Although you wouldn't understand the chemistry, just the result. You're not brewing yet, not in the way the Sumerians would later perfect. You are nurturing accidents. You are observing natural processes and tentatively encouraging them. It's like discovering that rubbing two sticks together makes fire. First, it's a surprise, might be even frightening. Then, it's a curiosity. Finally, it becomes a tool, something you learn to control and utilize. This accidental fermentation is still in the curiosity phase. It's inconsistent, mysterious, might be even a little bit suspicious. Is it safe? Is it a gift from some unseen force or a trick? You might even develop little rituals around it, using a specific lucky pot or adding a particular type of crushed berry, hoping to influence the outcome, purely based on superstition or a coincidental good result once. It's the dawn of off-once, understanding, the first flickering awareness that grain holds more potential than just bread or porridge. It holds the possibility of transformation, a liquid mystery waiting to be slowly, painstakingly deciphered over generations, and might be, the potential for the world's first hangover, prompting someone to grumble. Might be Augie's fizzy grain water wasn't such a brilliant idea after all. Okay, so we've imagined you and your neighbors stumbling upon the fizzy magic of fermented grain, recognizing patterns, might be even developing a few superstitions around your lucky pot. Remember that? It's a nice story, plausible even, based on how these things often happen. But it's mostly conjecture, drifting in the mists of undocumented prehistory. How do we get from hazy speculation about accidental brews to knowing with some certainty that people were deliberately making beer-like beverages thousands of years ago? This is where things get exciting, where we swap pure imagination for dusty, tangible evidence dug out of the earth. This is where archaeology steps in, trowel in one hand, high-tech lab analysis in the other. Imagine you're not a Neolithic farmer anymore, but part of a modern archaeological team. You are carefully brushing away layers of soil at a site called Godin Tepe, high in the Zagros Mountains of what is now Iran. It's a region that saw bustling trade and settlement thousands of years ago, a crossroads of ancient cultures. The sun beats down, much like it did on those early farmers, and the work is slow, painstaking. You're sifting through millennia of discarded pottery, collapsed walls, and the detritus of daily life from around 5,500 years ago, roughly 3,500 BCE, Bill 100 BCE. Then someone finds it, not gold, not jewels, but something almost more thrilling to an archaeologist. A pottery jar. Now, pottery itself was a game changer. Here's a mainstream fact. The widespread adoption of pottery vessels in the Neolithic period revolutionized food and liquid storage, cooking possibilities, and transport. Before pot, storing liquids or cooking grains efficiently was much harder. Leather bags, baskets sealed with pitch, carved stone bowls, they all had limitations. Clay, shaped and fired, offered durable, waterproof containers. Water, oil, milk, and might be something else. This particular jar from Godin Tepe is fairly large, with a capacity of might be 9 gallons or so. It's not just any old pot. Inside, Clinging to the porous ceramic surface is a yellowish, crusty residue. To the untrained eye, it might look like, well, old gunk, forgettable. But the archaeologists are intrigued. They carefully sample this ancient crust. Why? Because sometimes the residue left inside ancient containers can tell us exactly what they held. It's like finding fingerprints at a crime scene, but instead of solving a whodunit, you're solving a what was in it. You can almost hear the what was in it collective gasp. One man's gunk is another archaeologist's groundbreaking evidence. Back in the lab, scientists use sophisticated techniques like gas chromatography and mass spectrometry to analyze the chemical makeup of this ancient deposit. And they find something specific, a telltale sign: calcium oxalate. Now, calcium oxalate. Oxalate can come from various plant sources, but when it appears in significant quantities as a crisscrossing crystalline deposit inside ancient pottery from a grain-growing region, alarm bells start ringing. Call beerstone. That's your quirky tidbit. It's chemically similar to the scale that builds up in modern brewing vat. If they aren't cleaned meticulously, it forms when minerals in the water react with oxalates present in certain grains, particularly barley malt, during the brewing and fermentation process. Finding significant beerstone strongly suggests the vessel was repeatedly used for making or storing a barley-based fermented beverage. And guess what else they found traces of in that garden teepee residue? Barley. Not just any barley, but evidence consistent with processed barley, possibly malted or prepared in a way suitable for brewing. Suddenly, that crusty residue transforms the simple pottery jar into a potential ancient brewery, or at least a very large beer jug. The implications are huge. This wasn't just accidental mush anymore. This suggests deliberate, repeated production on a scale large enough to require a dedicated container. Someone, around 5,500 years ago, wasn't just hoping for a happy accident. They were intentionally making batches of this stuff. Maybe this very jar was someone's lucky pot, the one they knew produced the best results, passed down, or highly valued. The garden tep find is significant because of its age. It dates to a period before or right at the cusp of the rise of the great Sumerian city-states further south in Mesopotamia proper. It hints that the knowledge of brewing might have been developing across a wider region, perhaps independently, or might be spreading through trade networks even before Sumerian civilization fully flowered. It pushes the timeline for intentional brewing back further than previously thought, based solely on written records, which come later. Of course, archaeology rarely gives simple answers. Archaeologists still debate the exact nature of the golden teepee beverage. Was it thick and nutritious like a fermented gruel, consumed as a staple food, or was it thinner, more intoxicating, reserved for special occasions or rituals? Was it flavored with dates or spices, like later Sumerian beers? The chemical signatures tell us barley and fermentation were involved, but they don't give us the full recipe or the social context. Was this jar the ancient equivalent of a homebrew kit, or was it part of a larger, more organized production? We don't know for sure. What the golden teepee jar provide is a tangible link in the chain, connecting the hypothetical first sips of accidentally fermented brewing to the well-documented brewing practices of later civilizations like the Sumerian. It's a silent testament, preserved in baked clay and chemical residue, to human ingenuity and our early, enduring relationship with fermented grains. It proves that long before anyone wrote down a recipe or sang a hymn to a beer goddess, people in the ancient Near East had figured out the basic principles and were putting them into practice. They weren't just surviving on grain. They were transforming it, unlocking its potential for sustenance, pleasure, and perhaps even ritual significance. It's almost comical to think about the brewers back then potentially battling beer stone buildup without the benefit of modern brewery cleaning chemicals. Might be that's why some pots got discarded, a problem brewers still face today, just with slightly less ancient gunk. Alright, let's leave the mountainous region of Godin Tepe and that intriguing ancient beer jar behind for now. Journey south with me, down towards the flat, fertile plains, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the heartland of ancient Sumer in what is now southern Iraq. While folks in the Zagros foothills were perhaps perfecting their homebrew in relative isolation, something truly revolutionary was kicking off down here around the same time, and accelerating into the 4th millennium BCE. Something that would change the course of human history and create the perfect environment for beer to become not just a drink, but a cornerstone of society. People started living together, not just in villages, but in cities. Imagine witnessing this transformation. For thousands of years, human life revolved around small, scattered agricultural settlements or nomadic groups. Now, you see settlements growing exponentially. One place in particular, Uruk, becomes a behemoth, a sprawling metropolis of mud brick that dwarfs anything that came before. Mainstream fact, Uruk is widely considered by historians to be one of, if not the world's very first true cities. Forget the quiet rhythm of the village. Uruk is bustling, noisy, and probably quite smelly. Picture yourself walking through its dusty, narrow, winding streets. Houses are packed tightly together, mostly single-story dwellings made from sun-dried bricks, their flat roofs used for sleeping on hot nights or for chores. The sheer number of people is staggering. Some estimates suggest Uruk might have housed tens of thousands of people at its peak, a potential quirky tidbit. Figure us like 40,000 or even 50,000 inhabitants crammed within its walls are often cited, an unimaginable concentration of humanity for the time. It must have felt incredibly crowded, might be even overwhelming, compared to the open spaces you were used to. You'd probably need decent elbows just to get through the morning commute, dodging donkeys laden with goods and neighbors emptying well, let's just say plumbing wasn't a strong point. Looks like the city planners just tossed mud bricks wherever they landed and called it a street grid. What fueled this explosive growth? Scholars debate the primary drivers behind this rapid urbanization. Was it the success of large-scale irrigation projects, enabling massive grain surpluses? Remember all that hard work cultivating barley. Back in Section 1, growing populations needing central organization. The magnetic pull of powerful religious centers, or developing trade networks. Likely, it was a potent cocktail of all these factors, but the result was undeniable. A completely new way of organizing society. In the village, almost everyone was involved in food production. Here in Uruk, things are different. You see, specialized workers everywhere. Potters shaping clay on rapidly spinning wheels, metal workers hammering copper tools, weavers creating textiles, merchants haggling over goods, fishermen bringing in catches from the river, and crucially, farmers working the fields outside the city walls to feed the urban population. And overseeing much of this activity, a growing class of priests and administrators, often centered around monumental temple complexes. Looming over the city skyline are the ziggurats, huge step platforms made of mud brick topped with temples dedicated to the city's patron deities, like Anu, the sky god, and Inanna, the goddess of love and war for Uruk. These weren't just places of worship, they were administrative hubs, storage centers for grain and other goods, and symbols of the city's power and connection to the divine. Think of them as the original skyscrapers / government offices / warehouses, all rolled into one impressive mud cake package, demanding tribute and organizing labor. So, where does beer fit into this new urban landscape? Everywhere. Remember that grain surplus that likely helped fuel urbanization? Well, you have vast quantities of barley being harvested, processed, and stored, often under temple or state control. And just like in those earlier accidental scenarios, surplus grain plus wow. But now, its time equals potential, becoming less accidental and more institutionalized. With a large population no longer directly farming, you need a system to distribute food. Records from this period, scratched onto clay tablets in the earliest forms of writing, proto-cuneiform, show rations being allocated to workers. And what was a standard part of these rations? You guessed it, grain, often as barley, and beer. Beer wasn't necessarily a luxury item. For many, it was part of their daily caloric intake, a fundamental part of their compensation. It was liquid bread, safer to drink than potentially contaminated river or canal water, providing energy and some nutrients. Imagine getting paid partly in beer. Not a bad perk for digging irrigation canals or hauling bricks for the ziggurat all day under the hot Mesopotamian sun. Beats a pizza party, my bay. Furthermore, beer becomes deeply integrated into the religious and social life of the city. Offerings of bread and beer were standard practice in temple rituals, meant to nourish the gods and ensure their favor. Feasts and festivals, crucial for social cohesion in these large, potentially fractious urban populations, certainly involve the consumption of beer, helping to break down social barriers and foster a sense of community. It's the social lubricant we still recognize today, used to celebrate, commiserate, and simply unwind after a long day of specialized labor in the bustling city. The concentration of people also likely spurred innovation in brewing. Instead of just isolated household production, you might start seeing larger-scale brewing operations, perhaps associated with temples or wealthy households, needing to produce enough beer for rations, rituals, and thirsty city dwellers. The demand is higher, the stakes are greater, and the potential for refining technique increases. The city, with its complex web of specialists, administrators, and consumers, provides the fertile ground for brewing to evolve from a household craft or happy accident into something more systematic, more integral to the very functioning of civilization. The rise of cities like Europe didn't just change where people lived. It changed how they lived, ate, worked, worshipped, and drank. Beer wasn't just along for the ride. It was helping to fuel the engine of this urban revolution. So, picture the scene in bustling Uruk, or one of the other rising Sumerian cities like or Eridu. Beer is flowing. It's part of daily rations for workers. Remember those guys hauling bricks? It's used in solemn temple ceremonies. It's shared among friends and families. Demand is consistent, might be even growing. But how do you ensure a steady supply? How do you manage the logistics of brewing, especially when dealing with potentially unstable ingredients like freshly malted grain in a hot climate? You can't just whip up a fresh batch of fermented porridge every single day for thousands of people. You need something more reliable, something storable, something clever. Enter bapira. Bapira, often translated as beer bread, is one of the secrets to the Sumerians' brewing success. But don't imagine a fluffy loaf you'd slap some butter on. Oh no. Think functional, not fancy. Bapir was a purpose-built ingredient, a way to capture and preserve the brewing potential of barley in a stable, transportable form. It was less about making something edible, though might be in a pinch, and more about creating a reliable foundation for the actual brewing process to come. Making it was likely a specialized task, perhaps done in dedicated bakeries associated with temples or large estates that managed grain stores. Let's walk through how you might make it. First, you need your grain, primarily barley. You'd start by preparing the barley, possibly including a malting stage, allowing the grains to sprout slightly, and then drying them, which helps develop enzymes needed to convert starches into fermentable sugars. Then comes the grinding. Remember those saddle querns from way back in section 1, the back-breaking work of rubbing stone on stone. That basic technology persisted, though perhaps larger milling operations existed for this scale. You need to crush the prepared barley into a coarse flour or meal. Next, you mix this barley meal with water to form a dough. Just barley and water. Probably, for the most part, here's a little tidbit. While barley seems key, some researchers wonder if small amounts of other grains like emmer wheat or mybb, even trace amounts of flavorings like specific herbs or spices, were occasionally incorporated into the bapir dough itself, perhaps to influence the final beer's flavor or preservation, though solid evidence is limited. You knead this simple, dense dough and shape it, likely into flat cakes or rough loaves, not for beauty, but for efficient baking. Now comes the clever part, the double baking. First, the loaves are baked at a relatively low temperature. Goal here isn't to create a nice crusty bread, but primarily to dry the dough out too roughly, cooking it through and removing as much moisture as possible. Imagine pulling these pale, dense cakes from a beehive-shaped clay oven, a tanrua, similar to those still used in the region today. They wouldn't look particularly appetizing, kind of like extremely dense, bland crackers, but you're not done yet. Once these initial loaves are cooled, they are broken up, not crumbled into fine powder, but likely broken into smaller chunks or pieces. Exactly how coarse or fine the bapir was ground or broken after the first baking is still discussed by scholars. The size of these pieces would impact how easily the starches and sugars could be extracted later when mixed with water for the actual brewing mash. Too fine, and it might get gummy. Too coarse, and extraction might be inefficient. Might be they had different grades for different types of beer. These broken pieces then go back into the oven for a second baking. This time, it might be at a higher temperature, designed to toast the fragments thoroughly, driving out any residual moisture and imparting a slightly nutty, roasted flavor. This intense drying is crucial. It makes the bapir incredibly hard and shelf-stable. Think of something like modern biscotti or even military hardtack. This stuff was built to last. You could probably store it for months in sealed jars or baskets without it spoiling, which was essential in a world without refrigeration, battling heat, humidity, and those pesky grain weevils we mentioned earlier. Its durability likely earned it the nickname road bread for travelers, although trying to eat it directly. Dentists must have made a killing back then. Assuming they existed, you'd likely need a hammer, not teeth. So why go through all this trouble? Why not just brew directly from malted grain? Consistency and control. Freshly malted grain is biochemically active and susceptible to spoilage. Bapir, being dry and stable, paused that process. It allowed brewers to work with a predictable, reliable ingredient. Whether you brewed today, next week, or next month, the bapir base would be largely the same. This was vital for managing large-scale production for things like temple offerings or worker rations. Callback: imagine the temple quartermaster needing to supply beer for 500 canal diggers. Using bapir meant they could plan supplies reliably. It also made distribution easier. Instead of transporting bulky, perishable sacks of malted grain, you could transport compact, durable bapir. You could ship it downriver on boats, send it overland with caravans, or simply store it centrally until needed. The bapir itself wasn't beer. Not yet. It was the carefully prepared, preserved potential for beer. It was the foundational block, the essential pre-processed ingredient that brewers would take, crumble up, soak in water, and begin the magical transformation through mashing and fermentation that would lead to the final bubbly, intoxicating brew. It's a testament to Sumerian ingenuity. Taking a basic food staple, bread was central to their diet. That's a mainstream fact, and adapting the process to solve a logistical challenge in producing another essential commodity, beer. Forget surviving the apocalypse with Twinkies. A stash of Bapir might have been the Sumerian equivalent. Okay, so the Sumerians had their ingenious solution for stable brewing material. Bapir, that twice-baked beer bread we just discussed. Remember that rock-hard stuff? It solved the logistical problems of storage and transport, essential for keeping the cities running and the workers' ration. But how did they actually use it? How did they transform those dry, hard chunks back into the drinkable, enjoyable, and ritually important beer that lubricated their society? For the longest time, the exact process was a bit hazy, pieced together from archaeological clues and ration lists. But then, we got incredibly lucky. We found the instruction manual, sort of. It wasn't printed on papyrus or carved onto a giant monument. It was inscribed in delicate cuneiform script on clay tablets dating back to around 1800 BCE, though the text itself is likely much older, preserving traditions passed down orally for generations. And it wasn't titled Sumerian, Brewing for Dummies. It was a hymn, a beautiful, poetic song dedicated to Ninkasi, the Sumerian goddess of beer. We'll get to know her much better soon. Mainstream fact. The discovery and painstaking translation of these tablets, containing the hymn to Ninkasi in the 20th century, provided unprecedented insight into ancient brewing methods. Imagine finding this tablet, carefully cleaning off the millennia of dirt, and realizing you're reading not just religious praise, but a step-by-step guide to brewing, wrapped in devotional poetry. It's like finding an ancient scroll that's simultaneously a prayer and a perfect recipe for sourdough. Maybe IKEA should take notes. Their assembly instructions could certainly use a bit more poetic flair. So, let's try to unpack what the hymn tells us. Picture yourself not reading a dry technical manual, but hearing this hymn being chanted or sung, perhaps by the brewers themselves as they worked, invoking the goddess's blessing on their efforts. The hymn starts, appropriately, with praise for Ninkasi, born of flowing water. It then seems to lay out the process, starting with the preparation of the ingredients. It mentions wetting the malt set on the ground, suggesting the malting process we touched upon earlier, coaxing life back into the barley grain. Then, it speaks of using noble dogs to keep invaders, perhaps pests or animals, away from the malt heaps. Crucially, it talks about the bapir. Ninkasi, you handle the dough with a big shovel, mixing, in a pit, the bapir with sweet aromatics. There it is, our friend Bapir, callback to S5, the essential base. It's being mixed, possibly with more malt. Date honey is another interpretation of the sweet aromatics. Though this is debated, might be some crushed dates or other flavorings to add sweetness or complexity. This mixing might have happened in a large pit or vessel. Then comes the addition of water. Ninkasi, you are the one who pours out the filtered beer of the collector vat. It is Aliki, the onrush of the Tigris and Euphrates. Water is added to the mixture of bapir and malt, creating a thick porridge-like substance called the mash. The hymn doesn't explicitly detail heating the mash, which is a common step in modern brewing to help enzymes convert starch to sugar. Translation nuances mean experts sometimes differ on the exact interpretation of certain steps depicted in the hymn. Did they rely solely on the enzymes developed during malting and released during soaking? Or was there a gentle heating process implied but not explicitly stated. It's one of those details still debated. The hymn goes on to describe the separation of the sweet liquid, the wort from the grain solids. It speaks of spreading cooked mash on large reed mats or letting it run into a collector vat, suggests a straining or filtering process. Imagine tipping the thick mash onto woven mats, allowing the sugary liquid to drain through, leaving the spent grains behind. Might be not the most efficient filter by modern standards, but functional. Getting all that sticky grain separated must have been a messy job, probably less glamorous than the hymn makes it sound. Now for the magic, fermentation. The hymn gets beautifully poetic here. It talks about placing the collected wort into a special fermentation vessel, sometimes identified by the Sumerian term lamse, ninkasi. You place the fermenting vat, which makes a pleasant sound. You hold with both hands the great sweet wort. It even describes the visual. The fermenting vat, the filtering vat, the filtering vat, the filtering vat, waves fall. Here's a quirky tidbit. These lines poetically capture the sights and sounds of active fermentation, the bubbling so-too, the churning liquid, likening it to the great rivers, highlighting its vitality. This shows a keen observation of the process, even without understanding the microbiology. They knew that this stage, where the liquid seemingly came alive, was crucial. Finally, the hymn describes the finished product. Ninkasi, you are the one who pours out the filtered beer. The beer is ready. It was likely drunk relatively fresh, as preservation without modern techniques like pasteurization or sealed bottling was limited. The hymn itself concludes with praise for the goddess and the wonderful drink she enables. Reading the hymn to Ninkasi gives us more than just a recipe. It shows us that brewing in Sumer wasn't just a chore or an industrial process. It was considered a divine gift, an art guided and protected by a goddess. The language is reverent, elevating each step from mundane labor to a sacred act. It suggests that brewers might have indeed sung or chanted this hymn, treating their work with care and respect, believing Ninkasi's presence ensured a successful batch. Let's be honest, that's the secret ingredient. My own occasional homebrew attempts are missing. Forgetting to invoke the goddess probably explains a lot. The hymn provides a framework, linking the practical steps, using bapire, mashing, filtering, fermenting, with a deep cultural and religious significance. It's a window into a world where the transformation of grain into beer was seen as a minor miracle, worthy of song and divine patronage. So, the hymn to Ninkasi gives us a beautiful, almost sacred blueprint for turning bapire and grain into beer. We see the mixing, the mashing, the filtering, the fermenting, all guided by the goddess herself. But just like today, where a walk down the beer aisle confronts you with everything from pale lagers to dark stouts, hazy IPS, and fruity sours, Sumerian beer wasn't a monolithic entity. You didn't just order a beer. You lived in a world with a surprising diversity of brews, tailored for different tastes, occasions, and possibly even social classes. How do we know this? Once again, we hang the Sumerian penchant for record-keeping. Those ubiquitous clay tablets used for everything from tracking sheep to epic poetry. Also meticulously recorded administrative details, including ration lists and lexical lists, basically ancient dictionaries or encyclopedias, cataloging the words for things in their world. Mainstream fact, these cuneiform, administrative, and lexical texts are invaluable sources, frequently listing multiple distinct types or categories of beer. They didn't just write beer, they used specific terms, hinting at a whole menu of fermented possibilities. Forget a simple choice between light and dark. The Sumerians might have had their own ancient equivalent of a craft beer scene, albeit probably less focused on triple hopping everything. Let's speculate on what you might find if you could time travel to a Sumerian tavern or temple storeroom. First off, strength likely varied considerably. The standard beer issued as rations to laborers, remember those canal diggers and brick haulers from Section 4, was probably nutritious and filling, but perhaps not overwhelmingly alcoholic. Think of it as liquid sustenance designed to provide calories and hydration safely. Its main job was fuel, not necessarily a wild party starter. Workers functional the next day, after all, but then there were likely stronger brews. Texts mention fine beer or prime quality beer. These might have been reserved for the elites, priests, kings, wealthy merchants, or for special occasions like religious festivals and feasts. Making stronger beer typically involves using a higher ratio of grain or beer to water, resulting in more fermentable sugars and thus higher potential alcohol content. These premium beers might have been smoother, perhaps aged slightly longer, or made with more carefully selected ingredients. Imagine the difference between the everyday table wine and the vintage bottle, save for a celebration. A similar distinction probably existed for Sumerian beer. Ingredients also played a key role in variety. While barley was the undisputed king of Sumerian brewing grains, emmer wheat, another early domesticated cereal, was also widely cultivated. Some beers might have incorporated emmer, perhaps affecting the flavor, color, or protein content, which influences head retention and body, even if they didn't use those terms. And remember those sweet aromatics mentioned in the hymn to Ninkasi. This strongly suggests the addition of flavorings. Dates, which grew abundantly in Mesopotamia, were a likely candidate, often processed into a sweet syrup. Adding date syrup or honey would boost the sugar content, leading to stronger beer or a sweeter, finished product, and impart a distinct fruity flavor. Were other spices or herbs used? It's possible. People have always liked to tinker with flavors, although direct evidence for specific spices in beer from this very early period is harder to pin down definitely. Might be a Sumerian brewer tossed in some local herbs just to see what happened. The birth of the first spiced ale. Then there's the matter of appearance and texture, based on the brewing process described in the hymn and the common depiction of drinkers using long straws. We'll get to those. Much Sumerian beer was likely thick and cloudy, possibly containing suspended grain particles, yeast, and other solids left over from fermentation. It might have been more like a thin, alcoholic porridge than the clear, filtered beers many are used to today. You probably didn't just sip it. You might have needed to almost chew it. Dinner and a drink, all in one convenient, sludgy package. However, those terms like fine beer might imply that some brews were filtered more carefully, resulting in a clearer, perhaps lighter-bodied beverage for the discerning palate. Maybe filtration techniques improved over time or varied between brewers. The texts give us specific names, although translating them precisely can be tricky. The general Sumerian word for beer seems to have been kash, your quirky tidbit for tonight, but lists mention things like dukash sik, often translated as fine beer, ukash gin, perhaps black beer, and ikash cow, might be strong beer. There are terms that might refer to sweet, dark beer, possibly made with roasted grains or added sweeteners, whether certain beer types were distinguished primarily by ingredients, like barley versus dates, strength, color, clarity, overall quality, or their intended ritual versus mundane use, is sometimes unclear from the texts alone. Scholars pore over these lists, comparing them with archaeological finds and ethnographic parallels, trying to reconstruct the full spectrum of Sumerian brewing. It's like trying to understand modern car models just by looking at a parts list. You get clues, but not the full picture of the driving experience. So, instead of one generic Sumerian beer, you have a range. The basic, nutritious ration beer, perhaps a dark, strong brew for festivals, a sweeter, date-flavored beer for enjoyment, and a fine, possibly clearer beer for the gods or the king's table. Each might have had its own specific production tweaks, ingredient ratios, or even dedicated Ninkasi hymn variations. Okay, might be that last one, but who knows? It shows a level of sophistication and adaptation in their brewing, catering to different needs and preferences within the society. Far from being a primitive monolith, Sumerian beer culture appears to have been surprisingly diverse and dynamic. You can almost imagine a Sumerian beer snob turning up their nose at a mug of standard ration. "Oh, darling, I only drink the bukash sick from the temple's private reserve." Some things never change, right? All right, so we've established that the Sumerians weren't just making one kind of beer. They had a whole range, from the potentially rough and ready stuff for the masses to perhaps finer brews for the elite. Remember the Cherkash sick versus the standard brew. Cash from last section. Territory sure. Let's dive deeper into that standard stuff, the ration beer. Because in ancient Sumer, beer wasn't just for sipping socially or offering to the gods. For a huge number of people, it was literally part of their paycheck. Imagine this, you live in a big bustling city like Europe. You're not a wealthy merchant or a high priest. Might be you're part of a crew digging irrigation canals to expand the farmland, or hauling endless baskets of mud bricks up the ramps of a ziggurat construction site. Call back to S4. It's hard physical labor under a relentless sun. How do you get paid? Forget direct deposit or a crisp envelope of cash. Coin money as we know it wouldn't become widespread for millennia. In this largely pre-currency economy, compensation often came in the form of essential goods, the things you needed to survive, and two of the most fundamental items on that list were barley and beer. This wasn't some informal arrangement. It was a highly organized system managed by the major institutions of the time, primarily the temples and palaces that controlled vast tracts of land, stored massive amounts of grain, and organized large-scale labor projects. And we know about it in remarkable detail thanks, once again, to those durable clay tablets. Mainstream fact, archaeologists unearthed thousands upon thousands of Sumerian administrative tablets, many of which are essentially detailed records of rations allocated to workers. These weren't just casual notes. They were meticulous accounts listing names or categories of workers and the specific amounts of barley, oil, wool, and, yes, beer they were entitled to. It's like finding the ancient payroll department's entire filing system. So, picture yourself at the end of a long, grueling workday. It might be late evening, might be even getting towards this time, around 10 p.m. here in Vietnam, on this Monday night. You're covered in dust and sweat, your muscles ache. You line up with your fellow workers, perhaps presenting a clay token, or just identifying yourself to an administrator. A scribe sitting patiently with a stylus and a damp clay tablet, checking off names. And what do you receive? Your daily or periodic allotment. A standard ration for many basic laborers seems to have been around 1 seely of beer per day, along with a measure of barley. Here's a quirky tidbit. A selah was a Sumerian unit of volume, roughly equivalent to 1 liter. 1 liter of beer plus grain. That was your compensation for a day's hard work. Why beer? Several reasons. As we've discussed, it was nutritious, providing calories, hydration, and some vitamins, arguably safer than potentially polluted water sources. It was readily available. thanks to the large grain surplus and the established brewing knowledge. Using beer and the methods from the hymn, it was also easily divisible and distributable. Pouring out a liter of beer is simpler than weighing out tiny fractions of silver would have been, had they even used it commonly for wages. Who received these beer rations? All sorts of people connected to the big institutions. Unskilled laborers on public works projects were the most numerous, but records show rations for skilled artisans like weavers, potters, metal workers, who might receive larger amounts or perhaps better quality beer that you cash sing perhaps. Temple staff, administrators, might be even soldiers. The amounts varied based on status, skill level, and possibly gender or age. Those specifics here are often debated. A supervisor might get 2 or 3 sila of beer, while a basic worker gets 1. It reflected the social hierarchy, written in measures of barley and beer. Think your job's performance reviews are stressful. Imagine if poor performance meant you got downgraded to the thin, watery beer ration. This system had profound implications. On one hand, it ensured the basic survival of the workforce needed to build and maintain the complex infrastructure of Sumerian city-states. It kept people fed and hydrated enough to keep working. On the other hand, it also fostered dependence on the institutions, the temple or the state that provided these essentials. Your daily bread and beer came directly from the central authority. This could be a powerful tool for social control, keeping the large urban populations relatively stable and tied to the system. Of course, the exact degree to which these rations constituted a full wage, allowing for any kind of extra spending, through bartering your excess grain, perhaps, versus just being bare minimum sustenance to keep you alive and productive, is complex and still debated by historians. Could you trade your liter of beer for something else you needed? Maybe. But it seems likely that for many, these rations represented their primary means of survival. Forget saving up for a fancy new chariot. You were probably focused on getting your daily sila. It's a fascinating glimpse into a different economic world. No banks, no cash, just the fundamental exchange of labor for life's necessities, measured out in scoops of barley and jugs of beer. Imagine the logistics, brewing, storing, and distributing thousands of liters of beer every single day to keep a city like Europe functioning. It must have been a massive undertaking, a constant hum of activity ensuring that the liquid paychecks kept flowing. It wasn't just about quenching thirst. It was about fueling an entire civilization, 1 liter of beer at a time. You can almost hear the collective sigh of relief from the workers as they finally received their daily cash, the ancient equivalent of clocking out and grabbing a cold one, except it was also your grocery money. So, you've finished your long day of hauling bricks or digging canals. You've collected your liter of ration beer, your liquid paycheck, remember. Maybe you've had a simple meal of barley porridge or bread at home. But perhaps you're not quite ready to call it a night. Maybe you want to catch up on the local gossip, unwind with friends, or just escape the confines of your small mud brick house for a while. Just like people might head out after work on a Monday evening now, might be not quite as late as it is here, past 10 p.m. in Vietnam, but you get the idea. Sumerians needed places to socialize, and we're better to do that than that over a shared jar of beer. While much beer was consumed as part of rations or in domestic settings, evidence suggests the existence of dedicated places for public drinking. The earliest taverns, forget gleaming chrome taps and polished mahogany bars. I imagine something much more rustic. These establishments, sometimes referred to in text with terms like geisha, which might translate loosely to house of the heart or house of the interior, suggesting a place of gathering, were likely simple structures, probably indistinguishable from ordinary houses from the outside. You might duck through a low doorway out of the bustling, dusty street into a relatively dim interior. The air inside could be thick with the smell of fermented barley, human sweat, might be smoke from oil lamps or a small hearth, perhaps even the aroma of simple food being prepared. Who's running this place? Interestingly, textual and legal evidence from ancient Mesopotamia strongly suggests that brewing and tavern keeping were often professions associated with women. This is a well-established mainstream fact. These alewives or female tavern keepers weren't just serving drinks. They were often brewing the beer themselves, managing the establishment, perhaps extending credit and maintaining order, or trying to. It paints a picture of women having significant economic roles. At least in this particular sector, it was seen as an extension of domestic food preparation skills, or perhaps it was just an accepted niche for female entrepreneurship in a Sumerian society. Whatever the reason, it challenges some assumptions about rigidly defined gender roles back then. What's the vibe inside? Probably noisy and communal. Forget quiet corners for intimate conversation. Picture groups of people. Men might be sometimes women too, though the social norms are debated. Gathered together. They might be sitting on low benches or reed mats. The centerpiece of a group might be a large pottery jar filled with beer. And here's where those famous straws come in. Remember how we talked about Sumerian beer, often being thick and unfiltered. Callback 7, full of sediment and floating. Bits of grain husk. Sticking your face directly into the jar for a gulp might not be pleasant. You'd get a mouthful of crud. The elegant solution: long straws, often made from reeds or possibly even precious metals for the wealthy. Imagine several people sitting around a single large jar, each with their own long straw reaching down past the floating debris on top to sip the relatively clearer liquid beneath. It's communal drinking in its most literal sense. No need to worry about whose round it is. Just keep sipping from the shared pot. These straws weren't just practical. They likely became part of the social ritual of drinking together. You see this depicted clearly in Sumerian art, like on cylinder seals, little carved stone cylinders that acted like personal signatures when rolled onto clay. Images often show two or more people seated, facing a large jar, with long straws extending from their mouths into the vessel. It's an iconic image of Mesopotamian social life. What are people talking about? Probably the same things people chat about in pubs and bars today. Work, neighbors, politics, might be complaining about the temple administration or the latest royal decree. Perhaps haggling over small deals, sharing news from travelers, or just telling stories. These taverns were likely crucial hubs for information exchange in societies where most people couldn't read or write, need to know the latest price for wool, or hear about the prospects for the upcoming harvest. The local tavern might be the place to find out. It served that vital social lubricant function we mentioned earlier. Callback S4. Smoothing interactions and building community bonds in the potentially anonymous environment of a growing city. Of course, where there's alcohol, there's potential for trouble. Drunkenness could lead to arguments, fights, debts, and general disorder. Just as it can today, Sumerian society recognized this. While might be not as puritanical as some later cultures, there was an awareness of the downsides. Here's a quirky tadbit reflecting this. Though it's from the slightly later Babylonian period, the famous Code of Hammurabi includes specific laws aimed at tavern keepers. For example, one law stipulates that an alewife who allows seditious talk in her establishment and doesn't report it could face the death penalty. Another law dealt with fair measures, ensuring customers weren't cheated. These laws show that authorities were concerned about taverns potentially becoming centers of dissent or unfair practices. Keeping the beer flowing was important, but so was maintaining social order. So, were these taverns purely commercial businesses aiming for profit, or did they also fulfill a recognized social role, like a community center with booze? Whether these establishments were purely commercial ventures or also served social community functions is open to interpretation. They were likely a mix of both, run by individuals, often women, needing to make a living, but also providing a necessary space for social interaction, relaxation, and information sharing in the fabric of Sumerian urban life. They were probably lively, essential, and sometimes problematic parts of the cityscape, not so different from your average local dive bar, perhaps, just with more mud bricks and longer straws. You can almost smell the slightly sour tang of the beer, and hear the buzz of conversation drifting out into the Sumerian night. So, we've seen beer lubricating Sumerian society in the taverns. Remember those alewives and long straws, providing a space for gossip, deals, and unwinding after a hard day. It was the social glue, the everyday drink shared among colleagues and friends. But the story of Sumerian beer goes much deeper than just casual sipping or getting your daily life ration. Its importance stretched beyond the mundane, reaching right into the heart of their spiritual world, into the very temples where they sought to connect with the powerful, often unpredictable forces they believed governed their lives. Understand this, you have to step into the Sumerian mindset. Imagine a world animated by divine powers, the sun, the moon, the storms, the fertility of the earth, the success of the harvest, the flooding of the rivers. Everything was controlled by a complex pantheon of gods and goddesses. Keeping these deities happy was paramount. Offend them, and you might face drought, plague, or military defeat. Appease them, nourish them, show them proper respect, and they might grant you prosperity, protection, and abundance. And how do you show respect to a god? You offer them the best of what you have, the fruits of human labor and civilization. In Mesopotamia, the absolute staples, the symbols of civilized life made possible by agriculture, which the gods themselves were often credited with teaching, humans were bread and beer. Here's a core mainstream fact. Offering bread and beer to the cult statues of deities within their temples was a standard, daily practice in Mesopotamian religion for millennia. These weren't just casual snacks left out. This was the gods' daily sustenance, presented in formal rituals by temple priests. Picture yourself witnessing a ceremony inside the sacred precinct of a major temple complex, dedicated to Inanna in Uruk. Callback to S4. It's likely a restricted area, filled with an air of reverence. Priests, perhaps clad in special attire, move with solemn purpose before the imposing statue of the deity. Believed to embody the god's presence, they lay out offerings on an altar or table, platters heaped with specially prepared bread, containers filled with fine oils, selections of fruit, perhaps cuts of sacrificed animal, and alongside these, vessels containing beer. This wouldn't be the rough, everyday ration beer. Oh no, you wouldn't offer the divine protector of your city the cheap stuff meant for the ken or diggers. This would likely be the ukash, the fine beer, callback 7, we talked about, brewed with care, perhaps sweeter, stronger, or clearer than the standard fare. It might be poured into ornate cups made of stone or metal. A key part of thief art ritual often involved libation, the ceremonial pouring of liquid. You might see a priest carefully tilting a cup, pouring a stream of precious beer onto the altar or the ground before the statue, a symbolic act of offering the essence of the drink directly to the god. Think of it like a super respectful cheers to the cosmos, or perhaps leaving out cookies and milk for Santa, except the gods probably had more sophisticated palates and definitely preferred beer. Why was beer considered a beer? Such a fitting offering. Partly, it represented the pinnacle of agricultural achievement, Transforming barley into this complex, life-altering beverage was a testament to human ingenuity and the fertility granted by the gods. Offering it back was acknowledging the divine source of their prosperity. Furthermore, the association with Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, callback S6, inherently linked the drink to the divine sphere. Brewing wasn't just chemistry, it was a process overseen by a deity, making the product itself sacred. And let's not forget the psychoactive properties. While we don't know if Sumerian priests deliberately sought altered states through beer, in the same way some cultures use other substances, the mild euphoria, or altered perception, induced by alcohol, might have been seen as facilitating a connection with the divine, blurring the line between the mundane world and the realm of the gods. Beer also played a central role in religious festivals, which were huge communal events in Sumerian cities. These festivals, often tied to the agricultural cycle or mythological events, involved processions, music, feasting, and inevitably drinking. Imagine the New Year festival, the Wakatu, a complex festival with roots potentially back in Sumerian times. That's a quirky tidbit for you. A major celebration involving the city's patron deity. There would be public feasts, ceremonies involving the king and high priests, and widespread celebration. Beer would undoubtedly flow freely, fostering a sense of shared identity and collective joy, binding the community together in celebration of their gods and their city. It fueled the party, basically. Funerary practices. Grave goods excavated from Sumerian tombs often include pottery vessels, sometimes alongside cups and even drinking straws. The logical assumption is that these vessels contain provisions for the deceased's journey into the afterlife, and essential provisions would certainly include bread and beer, sustenance for eternity. Ensuring your loved one had a drink for the road was perhaps a final act of care. Of course, the exact layers of meaning aren't always crystal clear. The precise symbolic meaning of beer in certain rituals. Was it primarily representing divine sustenance, symbolizing life and fertility, acting as a purifying agent, or meant to induce a specific state in the worshippers or the deity? Continues to be explored by researchers, piecing together clues from ambiguous texts and fragmented iconography. But the core picture is clear. Beer was far more than just a thirst quencher or a form of payment in ancient Sumer. The very fabric of their relationship with the sacred. It was presented daily in temples, poured out in solemn libations, consumed joyously during festivals, and perhaps even sent along into the afterlife. It was a divine drink, a gift from the divine drink, a gods that was offered back in reverence, gratitude, and celebration. Even now, as the world outside sleeps late on this Monday night, here in Vietnam, the echoes of those ancient rituals, the imagined scent of sacred beer offered millennia ago, remind us of the deep enduring connections between human culture, spirituality, and the transformative power found within a simple grain. Just try not to trip when pouring the libation. You wouldn't want to annoy the gods. We've spent quite a bit of time now exploring how central beer was to Sumerian life, from its accidental discovery in forgotten porridge to its role as a liquid paycheck, a social staple in early taverns, and even a sacred offering poured out for the mightiest gods in solemn temple rituals. Remember those libations from Section 10. We've heard her name invoked, especially when we looked at that amazing hymn that doubled as a brewing guide, callback SCS. So, let's finally turn the spotlight fully onto the divine figure presiding over this entire essential enterprise. Ninkasi, the Sumerian goddess of beer. It tells you something profound about how vital beer was to the Sumerians, that they didn't just attribute its existence to a minor spirit or a general god of agriculture. No, They dedicated a specific goddess to it. Her name itself is revealing. Mainstream fact, Ninkasi, or Anankasi, is generally interpreted to mean something along the lines of lady who fills the mouth or lady who satisfies the desire. It's a name that speaks directly to the satisfying, thirst-quenching, hunger-sating properties of beer. She wasn't just the goddess of beer, she was the embodiment of the satisfaction it provided. The patron saint of happy hour, perhaps. Her mythological origins also tie her closely to creation and essential life forces. While Mesopotamian mythology can be a complex web with variations over time and place, Ninkasi is often described as the daughter of Enki, also known as Ea, one known as Ea, of the most important gods in the pantheon. Enki was the god of wisdom, magic, craftsmanship, and crucially, the god of Vabzu, the primordial freshwater ocean beneath the earth. What better father for a beer goddess than the lord of fresh water and skillful making? Her mother is sometimes given as Ninti, a goddess associated with life and healing. Her name means lady of the rib or lady who gives life. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some mythological traditions connect Ninkasi's birth specifically to Enki experiencing various aches and pains, with Ninkasi being created to help soothe his discomfort, positioning beer right from its divine conception as something comforting and perhaps even medicinal. Ninkasi wasn't just responsible for the finished product. That final frothy brew, her domain encompassed the entire intricate process. Remember the steps detailed in the hymn: handling the dough, mixing the bapir, tending the mash, pouring the wort, overseeing the fermentation with its pleasant sounds. The hymn portrays Ninkasi as actively involved in every stage, like the divine brewmaster, ensuring everything goes just right. She embodies the knowledge, the skill, and perhaps the touch of magic required to transform simple grain and water into this life-sustaining, mood-altering beverage. In a world without scientific understanding of yeast or enzymes, attributing the success of the brew to a benevolent goddess made perfect sense. Forgetting a step, or maybe not showing proper respect during the process, that could risk Ninkasi withholding her favor, resulting in a spoiled batch. Better sing that hymn loud and clear. You can almost imagine ancient brewers muttering prayers to her, much like modern home brewers might pray their airlock doesn't get clogged. Ninkasi, please guide my hand. Don't let this batch turn sour. What did people imagine she looked like? We don't have many definite images explicitly labeled as Ninkasi. Unlike major deities like Inanna with her symbols of stars and lions, or Enlil with his horn cap, Ninkasi seemed to be a more subtle presence in the visual record, envisioned as a matronly figure overseeing the bubbling vats, or might be associated with symbols of abundance like overflowing jars or stalks of barley. Her presence was likely felt more directly in the process and the product itself, the warmth of itself, the fermentation, the satisfying taste, the feeling of communal well-being fostered by sharing beer. How was she worshipped? The hymn to Ninkasi is our most direct evidence, a beautiful example of practical knowledge intertwined with religious devotion. Singing this hymn while brewing wasn't just about remembering the steps. It was an active form of worship, inviting the goddess's blessing. Beyond that, evidence for large, independent temples dedicated solely to Ninkasi is scarce compared to the major state deities. Whether Ninkasi had large public temples dedicated solely to her, or was primarily worshipped within the context of brewing operations, like temple breweries or by alewives in their establishments, and perhaps through smaller household shrines, is not entirely clear. She might have been more of a patron saint of a specific craft, deeply revered by those involved in brewing and by everyone who enjoyed its result, but perhaps without the massive state-sponsored cults of the top-tier gods. Her importance shouldn't be underestimated, though. In a civilization built on rain, where beer was a dietary staple, an economic unit, a social facilitator, and a religious offering, the goddess overseeing its creation was fundamental. She represented more than just intoxication. She symbolized the successful transformation of nature's bounty through human skill. Guided by divine wisdom, she stood for nourishment, for the satisfaction of basic needs, filling the mouth, for the pleasure and conviviality that beer brought to festivals and daily life. She was the guarantor of a successful brew, the divine force ensuring that the beer and water would magically ferment into something essential and enjoyable. So, when you think of Sumerian beer, don't just picture the liquid, picture Ninkasi, the lady who fills the mouth, daughter of wisdom and water, overseeing the bubbling vats, her presence ensuring the transformation from humble grain to the brew that fueled a civilization. She was the celestial brewmaster, the divine expert whose blessing was sought for every batch, embodying the critical importance and perhaps even the perceived magic of brewing in the ancient world. So we've met Ninkasi, the divine brewmaster. Remember the lady who fills the mouth? The goddess ensuring that the transformation from grain to beer happened smoothly, producing a drink vital for rituals, rations, and social life. But Ninkasi's blessing wasn't just about good flavor or achieving the right level of sacredness. Beer she oversaw provided some very practical, down-to-earth benefits for the people sipping it through their reed straws. Let's delve into why beer wasn't just enjoyable or economically useful, but potentially crucial for health and survival in ancient Sumer. Think about your daily life back then. You are expending huge amounts of energy, whether farming, building, or performing crafts. You need calories, lots of them. We know barley was the staple grain, providing the bulk of the staple diet, often as bread or porridge. But beer itself, especially the thicker, less filtered varieties commonly consumed, callback 7, was essentially liquid bread. It was packed with carbohydrates derived from the barley, offering a significant source of energy. That daily silai, about a liter of ration beer, wasn't just quenching thirst, it was helping to fuel the immense physical labor required to build and maintain Mesopotamian civilization, callback site. Forget your modern energy drinks filled with caffeine and sugar. Sumerian beer was the original carb-loading beverage for the working class. Beyond just calories, beer offered other nutritional perks. The brewing process, particularly the fermentation stage, driven by yeast, unlocks and creates nutrients. Here's a mainstream fact that's relevant. Yeast is an excellent source of B vitamins, such as thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, and folate. These vitamins are crucial for energy, metabolism, nerve function, and overall health. In a diet potentially lacking variety, especially in meat and fresh vegetables for the lower classes, the B vitamin provided by unfiltered beer could have been a very important supplement, helping to prevent deficiency diseases. It's almost comical to think about justifying your beer consumption by citing its vitamin content, but for a Sumerian laborer, it might have been genuinely significant. I'm not have been genuinely significant, slacking off. I'm replenishing my B vitamins. But perhaps the most critical health advantage of beer in ancient Sumer wasn't its nutritional content, but its relative safety compared to the available water sources. Picture the environment. Large populations concentrated in cities like Uruk, living alongside rivers and irrigation canals that served as sources for drinking water, but also repositories for human and animal waste. Sanitation was rudimentary at best. Waterborne diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery, caused by bacteria and parasites, must have been rampant and deadly. Drinking straight from the canal or a shallow well could be a game of Russian roulette with your digestive system. Even here in Vietnam, thinking about it late on this Monday night, having readily available safe drinking water is a fundamental aspect of public health we often take for granted. So how did beer offer a safer alternative? Several factors contributed. Firstly, the brewing process itself often involved heating the water when making the mash, soaking the beer and grains. While they wouldn't have understood germ theory, boiling or even just significantly heating water kills most dangerous pathogens. Secondly, the fermentation process creates alcohol, even at the relatively low levels likely present in much Sumerian beer. Perhaps 2–5% ABV for standard brews might be higher. For fine beers, alcohol has antiseptic properties and inhibits the growth of many harmful bacteria. Thirdly, fermentation makes the liquid more acidic, lower pH, creating an environment less hospitable to spoilage organisms and pathogens compared to plain water. Did the Sumerians understand the science behind this? Almost certainly not. They didn't know about bacteria or pH levels, but they were astute observers of their world. The extent to which Sumerians consciously understood beer's safety advantage over water versus simply noticing a correlation between drinking beer and better health is hard to gauge definitively. They likely learned through generations of trial and error, observing that people who drank primarily beer, especially instead of water drawn directly from potentially contaminated sources, seemed to fare better. They might have attributed it to Ninkasi's blessing or the inherent goodness of beer, rather than pasteurization or acidity. But the practical outcome was the same. Beer was often the safer bet for daily hydration. Forget reaching for bottled water, you'd be reaching for the beer jar. There's also some tantalizing, though often ambiguous, evidence suggesting beer was used in medicinal contexts. Here's a quirky tidbit. Surviving Mesopotamian medical texts inscribed on clay tablets sometimes list remedies or poultices where various medicinal substances, herbs, minerals, are prescribed to be mixed with beer before being ingested or applied. This doesn't necessarily mean beer itself was seen as the primary curative agent, but rather that it served as a familiar liquid base, perhaps helping to dissolve ingredients, mask unpleasant taste, or might be its mild antiseptic or sedative properties were considered beneficial for certain ailments. Imagine a Sumerian physician gravely advising, grind up these herbs, mix them well with a measure of strong beer, and drink it down. And call me in the morning, my bebe. Of course, we need to keep a balanced perspective. While moderate consumption of ancient beer likely offered significant nutritional and safety benefits, it was still an alcoholic beverage. Excessive drinking undoubtedly led to the same problems it does today: drunkenness, impaired judgment, accidents, potential addiction, and long-term health issues, though life expectancies were much shorter then anyway. Texts sometimes allude to the dangers of intoxication. The tavern, while a social hub, could also be a place of quarrels and debt fueled by overindulgence. Ninkasi might have been benevolent, but she presumably didn't approve of her gift being abused to the point of social disruption. Still, weighing the pros and cons in the context of ancient Mesopotamia, beer seems to come out significantly ahead. It provided vital calories and nutrients, a safer way to hydrate than often polluted water, and played crucial roles in social and religious life. It wasn't just a drink, it was a fundamental element of survival and well-being for vast numbers of people. Truly Ninkasi's gift that kept on giving, most of the time. Okay, so we've explored the surprising health benefits and nutritional value that Sumerian beer likely offered. Remember the B vitamins and being safer than water, making it much more than just an intoxicant. Ninkasi wasn't just providing a good time, She was helping keep people alive and fuel. But how did they actually make and drink this vital stuff on a practical level? What were the tools of the trade? Forget gleaming stainless steel tanks and automated bottling lines. Sumerian brewing tech was decidedly lo-fi, relying heavily on natural materials and clever, albeit simple, innovations. Let's take a peek into the ancient brewer's toolkit and the drinker's accessories, the undisputed champion of Sumerian technology, especially when it came to food and drink, was pottery. It's a basic but crucial mainstream fact. Pottery was absolutely essential in Mesopotamia, used for everything from cooking pot and storage containers to writing tablet and drainage pipes. Clay was abundant, easily worked, and could be fired into durable, relatively waterproof vessels. Without pottery, large-scale brewing, storage, and serving of beer would have been significantly harder, if not impossible. Imagine the brewery, perhaps attached to a temple or a large estate, or even just a dedicated area in a tavern keeper's home. You see an array of ceramic vessels in various shapes and sizes. Large, wide-mouthed vats would be needed for mixing the beer and malt with water to create the mash. Other big jars, might be slightly narrower-necked, would serve as fermentation vessels, those Ramsar mentioned in the hymn, callback S6, where the magic transformation happened, perhaps partially buried in the ground. To help maintain a cooler, more stable temperature, some pot might have had spouts near the bottom to help drain off the liquid without disturbing the sediment too much. Whether specific pot shapes definitely correspond to specific stages of brewing, like mashing versus fermenting, is often inferred by archaeologists based on size, context, where they were found, and residue analysis, rather than being explicitly marked. It's educated guesswork, like trying to figure out the exact purpose of every Tupperware container in a modern kitchen, just by looking at them. Storage was also key. Remember the beer, callbacks 5. Those hard, dry chunks needed to be kept safe from moisture and pests. Large pottery jars with well-fitting lids, perhaps sealed with extra clay or bitumen, a natural tar found in the region, would have been ideal. Finished beer also needed storing, whether it was waiting to be rationed out or sold in a tavern. Jars of various sizes, from large amphora-like containers down to smaller jugs, would be used. Keeping beer fresh without refrigeration or modern seals was a challenge, so turnover was likely quite rapid. You probably brewed what you needed for the relatively near future. No laying down beers to age for years here. Think fresh, local, and drink it soon. Then there are the tools for preparation. We've mentioned the saddle querns for grinding grain, callbacks 1, and the beehive-shaped tea-tanner ovens for baking the beer, callbacks 5. For filtering the sweet wort from the spent grains after mashing, the hymn specifically mentions reed mat, callback S6. Imagine laying these woven mats over a collecting vat and pouring the thick mash onto them. Messy, labor-intensive, and probably not perfectly efficient. But it worked. Might be finer cloth was sometimes used for premium beers, but reeds were cheap and plentiful. Cleaning these large vats and filters without modern detergents and pressure washers must have been a real chore too, probably involving a lot of scraping and scrubbing, might be needing a very small person to get inside the biggest ones. Oh. And now for the drinking implements. While individual cups and beakers made of pottery, stone, or even metal certainly existed and were used, the most iconic piece of Sumerian drinking technology, plastered all over their art, is the drinking straw. As we discussed, callbacks 9, the likely thickness and impurity of much Sumerian beer made drinking directly from the vessel difficult. You'd get a face full of floating bits. The solution: long, thin tubes to bypass the surface layer. What were they made from? most commonly probably hollow reeds, which grew abundantly along the rivers and canal. Simple, disposable, effective. Here's a quirky tidbit for the curious. Archaeological finds, particularly from the rich royal tombs of Ur, have included examples of drinking tubes made from metal, like copper alloy, sometimes even incorporating lapis lazuli or gold. These were clearly high-status items, the ancient equivalent of sipping your craft beer through a solid gold straw. Talk about ostentatious. These straws needed to be quite long, often depicted as reaching from a person's mouth all the way down into a large jar resting on the floor or a low stand. It paints a picture of relaxed, communal drinking, sharing directly from the source. Hey, unlike some flimsy modern paper straws, you can bet a sturdy reed or a metal tube didn't dissolve halfway through your drink. So, the technology was simple, based largely on clay, reeds, stone, and heat. But it was effective. Pottery provided the containers for every stage, from storing bapier to fermenting wort to serving the final product, essential beer bread. Grinding stones processed the grain, reed mats served as filters, and reed or metal straws allowed for consumption directly from communal jars, bypassing the sediment. It was a system honed over centuries, perfectly adapted to the available materials and the specific nature of their beer. Even now, close to 10:10 p.m. on this Monday night, here in Vietnam, looking at the technology around us, it's humbling to think about the ingenuity of the Sumerians, using basic materials to create the tools they needed for one of humanity's oldest and most beloved crafts. Their tech might seem primitive, but it successfully fueled a civilization. We've journeyed through the heart of Sumerian civilization, carried along by the steady flow of beer, from its accidental origins, through its role in rations, rituals, and rowdy taverns, guided by the goddess Ninkasi, consumed with practical straws, from simple clay pots. Remember all that tech from Section 13. Beer seems utterly fundamental, woven into every aspect of life. It feels permanent, enduring. But as the quiet deepens here in Vietnam, now past 10 p.m. on this Monday night, it's a good time to remember that history rarely stands still. Civilizations rise and fall, cultures shift, and even deeply ingrained habits can change over the long sweep of time. The golden age of Sumer and the absolute peak of beer's unchallenged dominance in Mesopotamia couldn't last forever. Centuries, the Sumerian city-states like Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Kish had flourished, often squabbling amongst themselves, but maintaining a distinct cultural identity in southern Mesopotamia. They developed writing, built monumental temples, established complex legal and administrative systems, much of it lubricated by beer, as we've seen. But the political landscape began to change. Ambitious leaders emerged, seeking to unite the region under single rule. Around the 24th century BCE, a powerful figure arose, Sargon of Akkad. He wasn't Sumerian but came from the Akkadian-speaking peoples to the north. Through military conquest, he forged arguably the world's first true empire, uniting Sumerian and Akkadian territories. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The rise of the Akkadian Empire under Sargon marked a major shift, effectively ending the era of independent Sumerian city-states, though Sumerian culture remained profoundly influential. While Akkadian became the dominant spoken language and administrative tongue, Sumerian lived on for centuries as a prestigious language of religion, literature, and scholarship, a bit like Latin in medieval Europe, used by the educated elite long after everyday conversation had shifted. Imagine scribes still painstakingly copying the hymn to Ninkasi in Sumerian, even as they chatted amongst themselves in Akkadian. This political shift was just the beginning. Over subsequent centuries, control of Mesopotamia passed through various hands. Periods of Sumerian resurgence, like the Ur III dynasty, followed by conquests by Amorites, leading to the rise of Babylon under famous rulers like Hammurabi, Hittites, Kassites, Assyrians, and eventually Persians. Sumer, as a distinct political entity, faded into the annals of history. What caused this decline? The precise reasons for the decline of Sumerian city-state are complex and still debated by historians, involving a tangled web of factors. Centuries of intensive irrigation, essential for their agricultural success, gradually led to soil salinization in southern Mesopotamia, making it harder to grow wheat and eventually even impacting barley yields in some areas. Climate change might have played a role, perhaps altering rainfall patterns or river flows. The constant warfare between the city-states undoubtedly weakened them, making them vulnerable to external conquerors. It was likely a slow process, a combination of environmental strain, internal conflict, and external pressures that eventually led to Sumerian culture being absorbed into the broader Mesopotamian tapestry woven by its successors. And what happened to beer amidst these changes? Did it vanish along with Sumerian political autonomy? Absolutely not. Beer was far too ingrained in the diet, economy, and culture. The Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians who followed were all beer drinkers. The ration system, the temple offerings, the social drinking, these practices largely not continued. The basic brewing techniques, likely using bapir or similar methods, persisted. Beer remained a staple beverage for the majority of the population for millennia. However, its status relative to other drinks began to subtly shift, particularly among the elites. Wine, made from grapes, started to gain prominence. Grapes grew better in the foothill regions to the north and west of Mesopotamia proper, and as trade routes expanded under larger empires, wine became more readily available, especially in centers of power. It acquired an aura of prestige, perhaps associated with foreign luxury, different cultural traditions, or simply its higher alcohol content and different flavor profile. Here's a quirky tidbit. Start seeing wine mentioned much more frequently, alongside beer in later Mesopotamian texts, particularly in records of royal banquets or diplomatic gift exchanges, often implying it was a more valuable or high-status commodity. It became the drink of choice for kings celebrating victories, or for wealthy merchants sealing deals, even if the common folk were still sipping their barley beer. Think of it like the rise of imported champagne, challenging the dominance of local ale at fancy parties. Beer was still there, but wine was the new status symbol. You can almost picture an old Sumerian traditionalist rumbling into his cup. Back in my day, we drank proper kush. None of this sour grape juice nonsense the Akkadians brought in. So, while beer certainly didn't disappear, it remained a cornerstone of Mesopotamian life long after Sumer's sunset. Its unique, almost unchallenged centrality perhaps diminished slightly. It had to share the stage, especially in elite circles. With wine, the cultural landscape changed. New languages were spoken in the streets. New gods might have been emphasized in the temples, though many Sumerian deities were simply assimilated or syncretized. And the political power shifted away from the old Sumerian heartland, the era we've been exploring, the time when Sumerian cities blossomed, when Ninkasi's hymn was perhaps actively sung by brewers, when beer was arguably beauty-defining drink of a civilization taking its first giant leaps, slowly drew to a close. The legacy, however, was immense. The Sumerians didn't just invent cities and writing. They pioneered large-scale brewing, integrating it deeply into their society in ways that would resonate for thousands of thousands. Years passed down through successive Mesopotamian cultures and influencing neighbors across the ancient Near East. Their beer-soaked civilization might have faded, but the thirst they quenched and the methods they developed to do it left an enduring mark on history. So, the sun eventually set on Sumer as a distinct political power. Its language became a scholarly echo, its magnificent ziggurats slowly eroded by time and sand, and its place on the world stage was taken by successive empires, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians. We saw how even the unchallenged reign of beer began to face competition from wine, especially in elite circles. Remember those fancy grape juice drinkers from section 14? It might seem like the end of the story, but the legacy of Sumerian brewing, much like the fertile silt deposited by the Tigris and Euphrates, nourished the cultures that followed, ensuring that their innovations echoed down through millennia. Think about the sheer ingenuity we've explored. That accidental discovery of fermentation, nurtured into a systematic process. The invention of Bapir, callback S5. That stable beer bread, allowing for storage and large-scale production. A brilliant logistical solution. The integration of beer into the very economic fabric through rations, callbacks 8, essentially creating liquid paychecks. The way it permeated social life in taverns, callbacks 9, drunk communally through straws, callback S13, fostering community, and its deep embedding in their spiritual world with offerings, rituals, and a dedicated goddess, Ninkasi, callbacks 11, overseeing it all. These weren't just quaint customs, they were foundational elements of the world's first urban civilization. And these ideas didn't just vanish when Sumerian kings stopped ruling. The Babylonians and Assyrians, who inherited Mesopotamia, largely adopted and adapted Sumerian brewing traditions, produced beer from barley, likely using similar technique. Ration lists from Babylonian times still show beer as a staple payment. Religious texts continue to mention beer offerings. Here's a little tidbit. Some later Akkadian and Babylonian brewing terms or names for specific beer types show clear linguistic roots going back to Sumerian, demonstrating that direct continuity. The essential operating system of Mesopotamian beer culture, initially programmed by the Sumerians, kept running for centuries, just under new management. The influence likely spread further afield too. Consider ancient Egypt, another early civilization renowned for its beer. Mainstream fact, beer, which the Egyptians call inhenket, was a vital staple in Egypt, serving as food, wages, and ritual drink, remarkably parallel to its role in Mesopotamia. While Egypt certainly developed its own unique brewing traditions, the similarities in beer's fundamental role, and even some technical aspects, like using bread as a base, are striking, pinpointing the exact lines of transmission for brewing. Technique across ancient cultures is complex, relying on scant evidence from trade routes and diplomatic contacts. But given Mesopotamia's status as an early hub of innovation, it's highly probable that Sumerian knowledge and practices regarding beer rippled outwards, influencing neighboring regions like the Levant, Anatolia, and possibly even Egypt directly or indirectly. They set a precedent, demonstrating how a civilization could be built, quite literally, on bread and beer. So, as we reflect back on this journey, from the first tentative sips of fermented gruel to the sophisticated brewing culture of the Sumerian cities, what stands out? It's a story of human ingenuity, of adapting to the environment, of building complex societies. It's a reminder that things we might take for granted, like a system for paying workers or the social customs around drinking, have incredibly deep roots. It's also a fundamentally human story. The desire for nourishment, for safety, remember beer being safer than water, for social connection, for a way to celebrate or to connect with the sacred. These are timeless. The Sumerians, living 5,000 years ago on those dusty plains between the rivers, felt these same needs, and one of the primary ways they met them was through beer. The world outside is likely quietening down, much like the bustling cities of Sumer eventually fell silent, but the echoes remain every time someone brews beer, every time friends share a drink, every time we marvel at how ancient peoples managed to build thriving societies against the odds. We are connecting, however faintly, to that legacy. The Sumerians might be long gone, their language unspoken, their temples buried, but their pioneering spirit, appreciation for a good brew, feels strangely familiar across the vast expanse of time. My Bibinkasi is still out there, somewhere, smiling faintly at humanity's enduring relationship with her transformative gift. It's almost like finding a really old recipe card from your ancestors, one that reminds you how little some fundamental human comforts have changed. And so, our journey through the world of Sumerian beer comes to a gentle close. Let the images of sun-baked bricks, shimmering barley fields, and communal jars slowly soften and fade from your mind's eye. The sounds of the bustling city, the chanting priests, the chatter in the tavern, let them become distant echoes, like whispers carried on the night breeze. There's no need to hold on to the details now, the names, the dates, the specific types of beer. Just allow the overall feeling to remain. A sense of connection to those ancient people, living their lives, facing their challenges, finding comfort and sustenance in ways both familiar and strange. Their world, once so vibrant and immediate in our imagination, now recedes back into the quiet depths of history. Feel the weight of your body relaxing, sinking comfortably into your bed. Go of the day's thoughts, the plans for tomorrow. Just focus on your breath, slow and steady, in and out, a calm rhythm washing over you. The story is told, the journey is complete. Now is simply time for rest, for stillness, for the deep peace of sleep. Allow your mind to drift, soft and easy, like a reed boat floating gently down a quiet river under a sky full of distant, ancient stars. Let the quiet of this moment envelop you in a comforting embrace. History sleeps now, and soon, so will you.